Hi everybody, I wanted to give you a brief video today about oxygen equilibrium curves because it's one of the hardest things to understand in this section of physiology. The first thing that it's really important to picture is I think what's shown on this slide, which is when oxygen diffuses into your pulmonary capillaries, into your bloodstream from the alveoli in the lungs, it is bound by hemoglobin inside these red blood cells. Right? In order for tissues to actually use that oxygen, so it's sort of no good hemoglobin having it, that doesn't do any good. It does good initially because it creates that partial pressure gradient that pulls oxygen continuously into the pulmonary capillaries by hemoglobin removing it from solution. But it doesn't, the tissues still don't have it, right? We need another step here. So hemoglobin has this oxygen. But if we want this to happen, that is, if we want oxygen to eventually leave the red blood cell and be delivered to the tissues so they can use it in the electron transport chain, which is what tissues are using oxygen for, then you have to have some mechanism for hemoglobin not to carry oxygen to a tissue, because it can just do that by floating around in the red blood cell, but to deliver it, to release it, to let go of it. So what we want is some sort of system where oxygen, so you imagine I'm oxygen and this is my hemoglobin molecule, although I could bind, this is my hemoglobin, this is my oxygen molecule. I could bind 4, but I only have 1. What you want is for me to hold on it really tightly here in the lung, because the lung tissue doesn't need any more, it's diffusing in, right? And then let go of it when I get to a tissue that's been using up a lot of oxygen and then therefore needs some, right? Well, that's exactly what the oxygen equilibrium curve is actually showing us. What it's showing, and you kind of have to look at it right to left here, right? Because as you decrease the amount of oxygen, and that's what's happening as we're moving left in this figure, as you decrease the amount of oxygen, hemoglobin holds on to oxygen less and less tightly, right? It starts to, that's what this is showing you, that its saturation, its fullness, and it's really a matter of binding affinity here, is going to decrease as you go down to the left. So if hemoglobin passes through a tissue, right now I'm just sitting here, so my leg muscles are not very active. So my leg muscles probably have a lot of oxygen in them because they're not using it up very fast. So let's say it passes through my leg muscles, 70 millimeters of hydrogen there. Hemoglobin's going to be like, I'm keeping this. You don't have any. Because this tissue has plenty of oxygen already. That doesn't need to give its oxygen away to those tissues. But then if it goes down to my small intestine, which is busy digesting my lunch, then here you've got a tissue that has actually quite little amount of oxygen in it because it's constantly using it up to run those calcium pumps that are needed to allow the smooth muscle of the small intestine to contract and to use to do the actual contraction itself, which requires ATP. So it's using up ATP all the time, so it's making ATP all the time, and to make ATP you need oxygen. So that tissue is using up oxygen really fast. So when hemoglobin goes through there, its affinity for oxygen decreases. Now, it's not because hemoglobin's like, I see you need oxygen. It's pure biochemistry. But the biochemistry is evolved to have the exact effect of delivering oxygen selectively to tissues that have low oxygen. So that's all this figure shows, is that when oxygen is low, hemoglobin will release it, and when oxygen is high, hemoglobin will hold tightly to it. And the effect of this is, again, to selectively deliver oxygen to tissues that need it. And this figure from the other textbook that we showed in class shows exactly that thing, that a resting tissue will have more oxygen, it'll be further to the right, and therefore the hemoglobin saturation will be high. This y-axis is labeled a little idiosyncratically. Don't worry about the label. Imagine that this says hemoglobin saturation. And then tissues in exercise will have less partial pressure of oxygen into them, and hemoglobin will release its oxygen to them. And remember, exercise doesn't just mean 1, 2, 1, 2. It's like includes any activity of that. So like my stomach doesn't exercise, but it does, when it gets food, have these contractions and do other metabolically costly things such as pumping ions and transporting nutrients and so on. So all those things count as exercise from that perspective in that tissue. Okay, so now if we look then at the effect of carbon dioxide, what we're doing is this. We're saying you take a system that we already have that selectively delivers oxygen to tissues that need it, and you're making it even more awesome by saying, hey, in addition to looking at oxygen and using that as a measure of how active the tissue is, let's also look at carbon dioxide, because tissues that are making a lot of carbon dioxide also must be really active, because you make carbon dioxide as a part of aerobic respiration. And so tissues that make a lot of carbon dioxide must be tissues that need to have more oxygen delivered to them. Sometimes people look at this figure and they say like, oh, it's because you have to exchange one oxygen for one carbon dioxide. You have to put oxygen to get rid of the carbon dioxide or something. Absolutely not. They have nothing to do with each other. Remember, almost all the carbon dioxide doesn't travel bound to hemoglobin anyway, and even the stuff that does, it's a different binding site than the one for oxygen, so there's no issue with needing to get rid of oxygen in order to take on a load of carbon dioxide. It absolutely does not happen. But it is true that if there's a lot of carbon dioxide, that suggests that the tissue needs more oxygen. So if you look at this, all it's showing is as you get more carbon dioxide, so we go from blue to red to green, at any given level of, any given partial pressure of oxygen, there's going to be hemoglobin holding on to oxygen less. That is, more delivery, more release, less binding of hemoglobin at that point. So if we just pick like this number 30, so if we're at 30 millimeters of mercury here of oxygen, if there's a lot of carbon dioxide, so as you increase your carbon dioxide here, you go from hemoglobin being 70-some% saturated to 60, all the way down to 40. So if there's a lot of carbon dioxide, only 40% of the hemoglobin essentially is going to keep its oxygen at that tissue, and the rest of it, off it goes into that tissue. So it's delivering oxygen selectively to tissues that need it. Now the CO2 thing applies in exactly the same way to pH because of this, right? Because carbon dioxide combines with water to make acid, and the carbonic acid itself, H2CO3, is not shown here because it dissociates immediately into acid and bicarbonate. So here's that acid that's lowering the pH of your blood. Whenever you have a lot of carbon dioxide, this reaction runs to the right and makes acid. So in your metabolically active tissues, this reaction's running to the right. There's a lot of carbon dioxide being produced, and that pushes, by the law of mass action, this reaction to the right, and you get all that acid. And so what you get is this, the same exact thing as we just saw for CO2. As you increase the acidity, so remember, more acid is lower pH. As you increase the acidity for any given partial pressure of oxygen, hemoglobin is less bound, more delivering of oxygen. The final effect that we talked about was the effect of temperature. There are actually other effects that we didn't talk about. And again, the effect of this interaction is that hemoglobin is going to deliver oxygen to tissues that are more active, because more active tissues are doing more aerobic respiration. One of the byproducts of aerobic respiration is heat. As the tissue does more aerobic respiration, it gets warmer. As it gets warmer, again, for any given partial pressure of oxygen, hemoglobin will be less bound to it, that is, delivering it more to that tissue. The net effect of all four of these things, the effect of oxygen on hemoglobin's affinity, on hemoglobin saturation, the effect of carbon dioxide, the effect of acid, which is closely tied with the effect of carbon dioxide, remember together they're called the Bohr effect, and the effect of temperature, are four different ways that your body amazingly delivers oxygen exactly to the tissues that need it. Isn't that cool?